Welcome to another edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a lens that I've talked about many times before, Nikon's 85mm 1.8 S-Series Z-mount lens, which I use in my Nikon mirrorless cameras. It's an excellent portrait lens, wide open, stop down, it's just great, lightweight. It weighs, let me just check my figures here, it weighs 1 pound or 470 grams. And I've been using it for taking still images for a lot of the videos that I do when I report on a camera, how the camera works, the features and so forth. And I use it to take close-up shots of, for example, the shutter speed dial or the self timer. And mostly I do these videos on manual focus film cameras. And in order to get close enough, I use extension tubes. And I have a set of these Vello Z-mount extension tubes. There's two in the set, a 12mm tube and a 20mm tube. And they're fairly inexpensive. I paid $80, maybe $75 for the set. I believe currently they're selling for $85. And they have metal mounts, and the barrel is plastic. These tubes are lightweight. They don't add much to the lens. The 12mm tube is 1.1 ounces or 32 grams. And the 20mm tube is just 1.4 ounces or 40 grams. And very simple to mount. And those of you who are unfamiliar with extension tubes, they're just a hollow tube. All they do is extend the lens further from the focal plane to enable you to focus close. So why am I using this lens and not a dedicated macro lens? Well, I had Nikon's 105mm 2.8 f-mount AFS macro lens, which gets you to 1:1, and it has built-in vibration reduction. And when the Z cameras came out, I was using it with the FTZ adapter, and it worked out fine. Then I heard that Nikon was coming out with a Z-mount 105 macro, and I sold my 105. And at the time, I was using my 70-200 2.8 Z-mount lens for close-up photography, sometimes using these, many times using these tubes. However, that's a heavy combination and really needs to be on a tripod when doing macro type work. And I like to go out with a macro lens, which I did when I had the 105, and shoot things like flowers and bugs and close-ups of a bunch of different things. And not necessarily at 1:1, but close. And I like to do that handheld with the built-in image stabilization, the IBIS on the Z8 or the Z6. It works out fine. And so I was doing that. And then when I got the 85-1.8, I figured, you know what, let me try the tubes with that. And it's a much lighter combination. I can go out handheld and do that. And of course, the camera has the IBIS, as I mentioned, and it works out really good. So right here I have my Z6. Actually, I'm being filmed right now on the Z8. And the pictures you're going to see in this video were shot with the Z8, with the 85-1.8, with the 12mm tube, and then some with the 20mm tube. So let me just mount the tube on very simply. Boom. Now there is a loss of light when using extension tubes because the lens is further away from the focal plane. But the camera compensates for that. So if you have the lens set at 5.6 and you're actually not at 5.6 with the 12mm tube, and you're not at 5.6 with the any extension, you're not going to be at the set aperture. And the camera really doesn't indicate that, but it's going to compensate because of the through-the-lens metering. Okay? And so you can see it's a very compact combination. and you could add the 20mm tube to the 12mm tube to give you a total of 32mm in extension. But on this particular outing, I just used the 12mm tube, then I switched to the 20mm tube, and more of the pictures were taken with the 20mm tube, and it worked out really good. And I set the camera, the fact that I was hand holding, I set the camera for continuous autofocus. Why? Because it's pretty hard to hold the camera steady when you're in a really close range. And of course, there's very little depth of field, even when you're stopped down. So I use continuous focus, so that if I moved a little, or if I'm photographing flowers or leaves and there's a slight breeze and they're moving, I was hoping that the focus would keep up. And it did for the most part, not entirely. Okay, so let me just explain how close you can get with this combination. So with the lens itself, with no extension, it will focus down to 2.62 feet or 80 centimeters. Okay, that's from the film plane, so that actually, from the focal plane, actually that works out to about 30 inches from the focal plane. And the Z cameras have a little indication on the top deck that indicates the actual location of the focal plane. Okay, so at that minimum focus distance without extension, it will cover a subject 10 inches wide. So you could fill the frame with something 10 inches wide. When you add the 12mm tube, you can now cover something 5 inches wide. And it will allow you to focus down to 19.5 inches, approximately. I did these measurements with a yardstick, so approximately 19.5 inches from the focal plane. Just with the 20mm tube, you can now cover a subject and fill the frame with a subject 3.5 inches wide. Now I'm talking about shooting horizontally here, okay? So it would be 3.5 inches wide, would fill the frame. And at that point, you are 16.5 inches from the focal plane to your subject. And then finally, if you add both tubes, so you now have the 20 and the 12mm tube mounted, gives you a total of 32mm of extension. You can now photograph a subject 2.5 inches wide to fill the frame. And that's a little more than half life size. So it gets you pretty darn close. And at that point, you are 15 inches from the focal plane to your subject. Actually, at that, with both tubes, from the front of the lens shade, and this lens comes with a nice big lens shade, you are 7 inches from the front of the lens shade to your subject. Okay, so it works out really well. I did not, as I said in the pictures you're going to see, I did not put both tubes on because I think with that it would have been more difficult to keep the subjects in focus. And so I just went with the 12 and separately the 20mm tube. And it works out really well. Like I said, it will miss focus sometimes because you are moving or the subject is moving. Ideally, when shooting really close, you should have your camera on a tripod. But for a lot of the subjects you're going to see, that would have been really difficult. Some were very low to the ground. I was just walking around discovering things. I would see an insect, and they usually don't cooperate and stay still for very long. So I think it worked out really well. We're going to look at the pictures. Is it as sharp as a dedicated macro lens? Probably not. Unfortunately, I don't have side-by-side pictures taken with my old 105 macro and this combination. I really didn't own them concurrently. But I think this worked out really well. Would I prefer to have the newer 105 2.8 macro? Yes, it has its own built-in vibration reduction, which works in conjunction with the IBIS in camera. And IBIS doesn't work as well in that macro range. So you know, you got to really be careful to hold the camera still. I was using fast shutter speeds. It was good light on this particular day. It was early in the morning and the sun had come up. So I had some really good light for a majority of the pictures. And the high ISO on the Z8 is great. Some of these were shot at 64, some at 400, 800 for a lot of them, and also 1600. And one other thing, when working with a high megapixel camera, such as the Z8, which is 45 megapixel, you could crop quite a bit. You could really crop a lot. So if you get down to the closest distance you can with, let's say, the 20mm tube, you could still crop in quite a bit more, which will bring you to 1:1. So it's a less expensive way to get into macro if you already own the 85mm lens. If you're a portrait photographer and you really like an 85 and you also want to do some macro work, this is a more economical way to go. Buy the 85 for your portrait work, pick up a couple of these tubes. You know, again, the set is $80, and now you are into macro range. The 105 currently sells for $846.95 at B&H. It's on sale, $200 off. Normally, it's $1046.95. And the older lens, the older 105 2.8 f mount, right now is actually selling for $899, but it's a gray market lens that B&H has. I believe that lens was discontinued by Nikon, so it's going to be hard to find a USA version. But if you have a Z-mount camera, there's no reason to buy that lens. Buy the Z-mount, or like I said, if you're a portrait photographer and you already have the 85-1.8 or you're thinking about it, this gives you another reason to buy it. Why don't we go look at some pictures? We're going to go through these pictures fairly quickly. I take too many pictures when I'm out shooting. I mentioned this before. The fact with digital, it doesn't cost me anything to shoot, but what it does do, it costs me a lot of time going through photographs. And I make slight variations. I may vary my exposure a little bit. I may vary my focus a little bit. And my son always tells me I have too many pictures in my videos. So I'm going to try to cut back on this one and show less pictures, but I think you will get the idea when you look at these images. Okay, this first image here was shot with the 12mm tube. In fact, until further notice, they will all be with the 12mm tube. This is at 5.6. And then when we zoom in here, we can see how sharp that is, especially to the right. That was probably where my point of focus was. So as I said a minute or so ago, I think you'll get the idea of how well this lens works with extension tubes. And here's another one. It was just a piece of metal. And now we're going to zoom in at f9. And here's just some letters I think was in metal. And that's at f9 as well. I tried to shoot a lot at 11 and f8. And this one here was at 5.6. So one thing, in reading some reviews on the B&H website of these extension tubes, at least one person said that they had no problem with them, but they were wondering how would they hold up with a heavy lens. Well, I have used these tubes either singly or stacked on my 70 to 200 2.8 Z mount zoom and had no issues at all. So now we're going to start at the 20mm tube, and the rest of the images were shot with the 20mm tube, of course, which allowed me to get even closer. I was right on the ground shooting these, kneeling down. These were in the walkway, and just, you know, some trees there, and looks like a nut from the tree, that previous shot. And the sun was low in the sky. It was, sunrise happened you know, about an hour before these pictures were taken. And there were a couple pair of sneakers just sitting there in this park. And I thought that made for, you know, an unusual, interesting shot, not unusual. And here's some more flowers. And this is a good combination for flowers. The fact that it's an 85mm, it gives you more working space. And as I said earlier, with both tubes at the minimum focus distance, you are at 7 inches from the front of the lens shade. And if you're just using the 20mm tube, you're 9 inches from the shade. I forgot to measure how much of a distance it is from the front of the shade with the 12mm tube, but it's going to be, of course, a little more than 9 inches. Now, this bug was crawling on my pants. I was kneeling down, noticed it, and banged off a couple quick shots as he climbed up my leg. And, you know, you saw the texture in the jeans. This, to me, this is the side of a tree. This is just the edge of a tree. And it reminds me of a mountain with something hanging off a mountain. I shot it both vertical and horizontal. This, again, is from a tree. This was at f10. And like I said, this combination works out really good for flowers. There's not much depth of field here. The focus was kind of in the middle there. And, you know, a lot of dying and dead leaves, but they made for decent subjects. And the breeze, there was a breeze, like on an image like this. And in this case, it's pretty sharp. And the continuous autofocus that I had set was a big help with that, because if I had been using single focus, you know, by the time I focused, pressed the shutter release, the leaf or the branch or the flower could have potentially moved, and of course I could have moved. Now here's just some nuts on the ground, and these final two shots were at 1.8, so there's very little depth of field, but there is some sharpness there right in the center going across this leaf. And the same thing here, very little sharp, but right in the center of this rock. Okay, so that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, comments on anything photography related, doesn't have to be related to this video, please leave your comment or question in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I usually publish a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. If you have any subject which you would like me to cover in a future video, please leave that in the comments below. I'd be happy to try to tackle a new subject. I'm always trying to come up with something new and different. In fact, my next video will be a video about using Sigma's 15mm 2.8 f-mount fisheye lens. That lens is no longer manufactured. It's been out of production a good while, I believe, but it's a very interesting lens, very specialized, but it gives a unique look to your images. So look for that video next time. So again, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.